test the volume. Says we're live. Let's see if I can hear it. Oh, good. We're working today. That's good. All right. So today we need to talk about both marketing research and also marketing segmentation, targeting, and positioning. You usually use marketing research to go about selecting market segments and then establishing the way to target and then ultimately position your product. So at the beginning of class, I asked, and I was unable to confirm this myself because the first few lectures that I didn't realize that the microphone was not working in all the other classrooms. The microphone is a noise canceling microphone that's just sort of in the center of the room that's by the projector, and it picks up, but in this classroom you either have to use the handheld mic or the other mic. So I had to confirm this morning with a couple of your classmates that I had asked, is marketing an art or a science, in a previous lecture, and apparently I have asked that question. So just as a sort of refresher, since we're talking about marketing research, this is the scientific part of marketing, and going back to what you need to know about in terms of thinking about how we go about establishing a discipline is looking at the definition of marketing. And so I have pulled up the AMA's definition. Now this definition has changed over time. The definition of marketing is the activity, set of institutions and processes for creating, communicating, delivering, and exchanging offerings that have value for customers, clients, partners, and society at large. I would add to that, and this is often a test question, that marketing is a pervasive social activity. We do it constantly, and one of the things that should come tripping off your tongue, if nothing else comes off your tongue at the end of this class, is that because it is a pervasive social activity, it is the only fully integrated function of the firm. You can get away without knowing anything about double entry bookkeeping, as I've said in the past, or whether or not you need to finance through capital or through equity, which is the two ways that you answer the capital finance question. In finance, you can know nothing about management. You have to know something about marketing. Marketing seeks to add value across all aspects of the firm. And so it is critically important. And so I think that addition to the definition is one of those things that the American Marketing Association, I've written a paper on this, should actually consider, is that it is a pervasive social activity. We do it constantly, right? Everything that we do is about marketing. The clothes you wear make statements about you. What is the clothing that I'm wearing say today? Well, it was cold when I went outside and started my car this morning. Now it's getting hot and I'm gonna have to start peeling back the layers. It's that time of year in Oklahoma where you have to dress because this building will either be hot or cold depending on which room you're in, and you have to dress. So, the statement is, I was cold this morning and I like Pendleton, I guess, is what it, but that's a marketing statement fundamentally, right? The things we choose to wear, all of that is part of marketing. So, marketing research. So the scientific method, the text says was developed in the 17th century. I would argue that the scientific method goes back to Aristotle. And I talk a lot about Aristotle in my marketing ethics class, but I would say that he was like one of the first scientists. He went about studying things by defining disciplines, and almost every discipline owes something to Aristotle. So it's one of the philosophers in my marketing ethics class that I dote on. It's based on empirical evidence, meaning that we can count it. We can test it. It is repeatable, and it is subject to falsification, right? So we always have to be aware of what Karl Popper calls the null hypothesis, or which he says is the only real science, is disproving the hypothesis through the null, which is if we start out with a simple proposition, we go out and we observe things, which is the first step in the scientific method, is we observe stuff. Let's say we observe that all cows eat grass, or we think all cows eat grass. We look at a bunch of cows, they're eating grass. Well, the minute we find one cow that won't eat grass, right, we've disproved that all cows, and we can refine the question then and say, most cows eat grass, right? So we always have to be aware of the fact that we can be wrong. And it's important in conducting scientific research that we always stay aware of the fact that we could in fact be incorrect in something. So we make these observations. People like to buy stuff, right? They want to engage in purchasing. One of the things that we look at in this research is, why is it that people want to buy stuff? Well, as we've gotten more sophistication in terms of understanding human psychology, or psychiatry rather, in terms of what happens in your brain when you buy something, what happens? You get happy when you buy stuff. That's one of the things that makes marketing fun, is that you look at all of the stuff that we can buy, and we can talk about advertising and persuasion, and it makes us happy to buy stuff. You all do this constantly. You get a little charge when you go on and you buy something, and you like it. Now, that thrill degrades, which means that people engage in, spending crimes, because they're constantly looking for that, that little charge that makes you happy when you buy something. So we make these observations. People like to buy stuff. We're going to think about interesting questions like, well, if people like to buy stuff, what kind of stuff do they want to buy? What makes something more popular than something else? Why is it that they want this product over that product? Why is it that I wanted a Pendleton jacket that I'm wearing today instead of a North Face jacket, or a Coach, or any other number of name brands that we could think of? So interesting question. Why is it that people want? Well, we're going to talk about segmentation, targeting, and positioning. So differentiation is maybe one of the things that we want to focus on. How do we differentiate those products? What do we do to make our product different? So we think of interesting questions. How are we going to differentiate this product in the market and come up with better results? So we're going to formulate hypotheses, right? And then from those, we develop testable predictions. We're going to gather our data, and we're going to test that data. If it doesn't turn out the way we think it is, because the null hypothesis suggests that we were wrong in our thinking, we're going to refine, and then maybe come up with new hypotheses, retest, right? Gather data, and then develop general theories. Now, generally in marketing, the theories that we develop are not grand level theories of things. There are very few law-like generalizations that we can come up with as a result of marketing science. But this is the hard science part of the course, and it's the part that students like the least. And I have to tell you, it's honestly the part that I don't really care for as much as well, either, because I have a tendency to be a grand theory type of person, looking at interesting grand theories that we can come up with, which is how can we know what we know in terms of marketing. So marketing research is the process of defining marketing problems and opportunities, systematically collecting and analyzing the information that we can get, and recommending actions to be taken based on those. So there's no point in doing marketing research if you're not going to do something with it. And lots of companies don't engage in marketing research. And it's one of the reasons that most companies fail within the first 5 years of existence, because they don't engage in marketing research. In the past, one of the reasons that they didn't engage in marketing research is because marketing research is it was thought to be complex in determining how things are actually occurring in the real world. That was really difficult to do without having some sort of advanced degree. It's becoming easier and easier with the availability of big data and the ability to ask questions. And for those of us who engage in this, to encourage you as you go out, a lot of my students say they want to be entrepreneurs. Engage in actual, sort of basic marketing research, because it's easier and easier and easier with the availability of the tools that we have now. In the past, it was really hard to do statistical analysis. You can now do these kinds of things very easily by using Excel, for example. Why is it that, all these companies ask you for your opinion when you finish using their product or service? Walmart does it perpetually, right? And they used to give you an opportunity to win. They don't really do that anymore. They ask you at the end, how was your experience? And they're gathering all that data, right? So it's becoming easier and easier to do. And it's one of those things that I think more and more businesses should. But again, there's still a lot of mystery because it seems hard. And marketing science can be really hard. A lot of times we'll hear people say things like, it's not rocket science. And my response to that is, marketing is harder than rocket science. Rocket science operates within very well-defined parameters of physics. We know with a great deal of certainty whether or not we are going to be able to get a rocket into orbit based on very well and precisely defined mathematical formulas. It becomes harder when the number of variables increases, and the reason why people want something or something becomes popular is enormously difficult in many instances to predict. Think about a year or two ago, this thing became really popular among people in your age group based on some social media influencers who were by people not in your age group. How many of you remember when the Stanley Cup, and we don't mean the sports trophy, became a big, everybody wanted these, it was sort of like the, what's the brand of cooler that everybody wants that my brother has? Yeti, yeah. So, you know, I don't know why Yeti became popular, because they became popular before, you know, social media influencing was really a big deal. But all of a sudden, as I understand it, as I recall reading at the time, these soccer moms who were on social media started talking about their Stanley Cups, and all of a sudden everybody went crazy for these Stanley Cups. And that's an old company that's been around for a long time. It became wildly popular, and now, I don't know, like all of my students were walking around at that time carrying Stanley Cups, and now I don't see any of them anymore. It's one of those things that's sort of passing fad. Why is it that took off? Why is it, you know, that Beanie Babies took off? Yeah.
Because people see it all like online, like TikTok and stuff, and it's like, oh, this is the new cool thing, so we all gotta get it.
Right.
And then when the next cool new thing comes out,
They want that.
Yeah, we live in a very consumer-based society.
That is absolutely true. And we all want what everybody else seems to have. I remember when Apple came out with the watch. I have never owned an Apple Watch. I wear like fine Swiss watches. That's my thing. So my favorite is my Rolex. But I don't want, I mean, like I was like, why the hell would anybody want that watch? But everybody wanted that watch. And, you know, I don't know that it's terribly useful. And by the way, during COVID, Rolex made a resurgence. The price of Rolex like skyrocketed because all of a sudden people had all of this discretionary income and they were looking around for things. And so Rolex made a big comeback. But yeah, everybody wanted the Apple Watch, and that was sort of the big thing that they were focused on. So challenges to marketing research. The issue of knowledge, and I've talked about this before. What is it we can know and how can we know it? And I've used this example, which is a question that is used in the ethical position questionnaire. We use it a lot in research on marketing ethics. For example, we've used this questionnaire. It's been written about in a lot of our literature. One of the questions says, rigidly codifying an ethical position that prevents certain types of actions could stand in the way of better human relations and adjustment. What's wrong with this question? When we ask the question, what we do is we take all of these questions combined, and then we put people on a matrix, a 2x2 matrix, as to whether or not they are motivated by ideals or more concrete examples, and whether or not they are rule bound or they're more sort of relativistic in their thinking. And whether or not you believe, and it asks you on a Likert scale, and there's also issues with the Likert scale in terms of how many points you should have in the Likert scale. So you all have been familiar with the Likert scale, even though you probably didn't know what it was called. It will say, how much do you agree or disagree with the following statement? You know, I strongly agree, I agree, I'm neutral, I disagree, and I strongly disagree. So that's a 5-point Likert scale. You can have a 7-point Likert scale. Whether or not you have something in the middle that is absolutely neutral is an issue that's become sort of debate in a lot of the scientific research asking questions literature, in that most people have opinions. Even if it's just slight, they don't actually are not neutral on most things. They actually do have an opinion. But if you let them have a neutral option, an absolute middle score, they oftentimes will take that score, because we're just sort of programmed to think that, well, if I don't feel strongly about something, I'll just answer the middle score. It's also one of the reasons why we have a tendency to order the medium size, right? McDonald's came up with this taxonomy of small, medium, large, which is one of the reasons why I think Starbucks is a tool of the devil and should be shut down. The devil has many tools. Starbucks is one of them. I cannot stand Starbucks, but you go into Starbucks and you say, I want a medium. They're like, you mean a tall, no, or a grande, that's it. And grande is not grand, right? And tall is not tall, it's short. And venti, what the hell is that? 20. Yeah, I know, it's 20. We have a taxonomy. It was started by, it's small, medium, large. Most people tend to go with the medium size, right? That's just sort of our default position. But anyway, also things when we ask questions that we have to think about is issues of bias, social desirability. If you ask people how often they brush their teeth, they're going to tell you 2 by 2, because we've been programmed to think of that. 2 times a day, 2 minutes each time, right, in order to get the plaque off. And then we oftentimes have to face a disconnection between desire and attitude, or between desire and action, for a multitude of reasons. So we can think that we're going to do really, really well with a product because we've asked people and they say they like it, and then they don't actually take the marketing actions that we want them to take. So step 1, we need to define the problem. What is our question based on the observation? How do we, for example, increase market share? Or how do we increase sales a certain percentage of a product over quarter or something like that? And then we've got to set our research objectives. These should be, and this should become as no surprise, specific and measurable. What's a good question? Well, one that allows for a great deal of specificity and is also measurable. Let's think about the marketing, and one of the reasons that we see the United States as being one of the most religious nations in the world is because our churches do a pretty good job of marketing themselves. Now we could ask, what would increase, the attendance at church? Well, one thing that we might think about is, well, if we could offer an absolute proof for the existence of God, maybe that would encourage more people to go to church. That's pretty specific. Going to have a hard time measuring it, right? One of the things that got me interested in philosophy as a younger person was whether or not we could prove the existence of God. It's really hard to do. Very specific question, really difficult to measure, right? So specific and measurable. Then we can define research in terms of 3 types. Exploratory. What is it that we sort of want? We want to tease out maybe an idea and determine whether or not there's any validity to it. Or maybe descriptive, talking about how often something happens. How often do people buy toothpaste? How often does the average consumer go to McDonald's? Things like that. And then causal. This is the hardest, to get a connection between the data and action, right? So a lot of things can have correlation, but not necessarily causation. And you have to think about that. Correlation doesn't necessarily equal causation. One of the things that some research discovered as a unique artifact of the population of the nation of India was that the number of electronic devices a household had was inversely related to the number of children that the household had. What does that mean when you say it's inversely related? The number of electronic devices that a household has is inversely related to the number of children that the household has. You had your hand up first. As they have more kids, I have to think about, yes. As they have more kids, they have less electronic devices. So more electronic devices means that you're likely to have less kids. That's probably exactly the opposite of what's occurring in the United States, where the more kids you have, the more electronic devices you probably have, because you need to be able to entertain them. And so it's a really easy way of entertaining people is by giving them electronic devices. We've all become addicted to the electronic devices. Well, when this research was conducted, it was largely before the advent of the smartphone. Now, what you could deduce from that is that electronic devices lead to infertility. Right? Lots of electronic devices, fewer kids. You could hypothesize that they're causing infertility. Probably not. High levels of correlation, an R squared of something like 0.75. But what's more likely? The answer there. Yes. The households that don't have, and probably going along with that, the households that have more money to spend have higher levels of education, and those people with higher levels of education are less likely to have large families. The more educated you are, the less likely you are to have a large family in many instances. Why? Because children in those kinds of economic situations are expensive. That's when we moved from being an agricultural society to an urban society. Before we were an urban society, and the urbanization of America switched in about 1920, the first year that the census recorded a vast majority, or a slight majority, not a vast majority, a slight majority of people lived more in urban areas than in rural areas. When we were a rural and agricultural society, children are an economic asset because you need them to work on the farm, which is one of the reasons why we have summer vacation in the United States, because you needed your family to be able to go out and work on the farm. That's why it lasted basically from planting to harvest, the summer break in the US. So that was an economic benefit. But as you move into the city, that becomes less and less true, right? So it's probably the fact that you have higher levels of education, which leads to fewer children in the family. So we have to always be aware of that. So we're going to develop the research plan, which means that we're going to identify the limitations that we have. We can't know everything, right? If we're very specific and measurable, we can't oftentimes make grand level theories. What data is needed? Do we need qualitative versus quantitative data? How are we going to collect that? Are we going to look at things like the population of a universe versus a sample? How do we get participation in that? And then how do we deal with the issue of what I call deviant responders? People who answer our surveys, but they just check boxes willy-nilly. Just, to get the, one of the things we know is that if you offer people some kind of benefit for the survey, they're more likely to take the survey. Now, the benefit has to be pretty immediate. That's one of the things that we figured out through marketing research. One of the problems that Walmart had by asking you to complete their surveys was that it wasn't an immediate benefit. And it was like you could be entered into a drawing to win a $5,000 shopping spree, was one of the things that they did for a long time. That resulted in very low participation, because although the reward was pretty big, the chances of getting that reward were pretty small. right? And so you can run into issues where you can get people to take the survey, but how do you know that they're actually answering honestly? So what kind of data are we going to need? Secondary data is data that's already collected. It's usually less helpful in terms of making predictions or causation. Primary is collected for the specific project that we have in mind. Is it qualitative, like in-depth interviews that we're going to ask in terms of looking at things like consumer ethnography, how people actually go about using the products and services that we provide? When I was on a flight coming back from Las Cruces, New Mexico to Oklahoma one time when I was getting my PhD, I sat next to a guy. This was when the iPad was still fairly new. And I said, how do you like your iPad? And he said, oh, I love it. You know, it's made for business. And I was sitting there going, no, it was not made for business. He's like, yeah, they invented it just for business. And I'm like, no. And in fact, it's a horrible tool. At the time, I had what I referred to as my Crackberry, which was the BlackBerry telephone. And the BlackBerry actually was a better platform for business than the iPhone. But when the iPhone came out, all business executives wanted the iPhone, even though it was a worse platform. Why is it a worse platform for business in terms of its functionality? You don't have a full keyboard that you can, if you know how to touch type. I was enormously fast. I didn't have to look at my Crackberry to be able to send emails or text messages very quickly because I know how to touch type. I know how to use the QWERTY keyboard, right? You all probably learned keyboarding in high school or junior high. You learn it pretty quickly now because it offers, if you know where things are on the keyboard, you can't do that with an iPhone. Even though you have the QWERTY keyboard, you have to look at it to actually be able to know, because you can't tell one letter from another on a flat surface that has no differentiation between the locations on the keyboard with regard to sort of a raised sort of surface like you have on a full-size keyboard. So looking at consumer ethnography, in-depth, things like that, focus groups where you have 10 people and a moderator. These oftentimes will lead to the ability to narrow down research questions so that we can then ask questions and go about gathering quantitative data where we can use statistical modeling for prediction. So then we analyze our findings utilizing the appropriate methods like ANOVA, regression. We use a lot of regression, for example, in determining inventory control. Present those findings. I say that this should be direct and not a mystery. I got a paperback from a journal, and the reviewer said, I shouldn't have to guess, like an Agatha Christie novel where you're going with this research. My mother, who was a creative writing teacher, would tell me, Grant, your writing is uninspired. Yes, that's the way academics write, I had a student once who wrote on an exam, I approached this problem eager as a squirrel in an oak forest. When wham bam, the answer came to me like an elephant in a circus tumbling routine. And I wrote back, I leapt like a gazelle to the conclusion that you need to take a creative writing course and get this out of your system. Right? So straightforward. I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you. I'm going to tell you what I found, and then I'm going to tell you what the recommendations are, right? So it should be straightforward. Understandable. We oftentimes use marketing dashboards in our customer relationship management to determine things that we need to do to take next steps. And then the rule of parsimony, be brief. Finally, we need to make recommendations based on that, implement based on those recommendations, and then evaluate whether or not we are correct. This all takes time, it's complex, and so a lot of times people don't want to do the hard work. They just have an idea, and this happens even in big companies. I can give you an example of this. We used to do market testing. I worked with a company, or had a company that did market testing for local firms, and one of the ones that we did market testing for was a company that started in Oklahoma called Sonic, and we did this market testing, and the president of Sonic at the time was like, you know what I think people want? Margarita cherry slush. And we sat there and said, why? Well, I think that would be a good flavor. That's called projection. Probably not going to work out well for you. Any questions on marketing research? If you are a marketing major, you will have to take marketing research. I'm sorry, it's the course that students like the least because it's not the most fun part of marketing. It's not like advertising or integrated marketing communication where you get to look at Super Bowl ads and stuff like that, but it is a necessary part. So we need to, based on marketing research, we often can use that to determine market segments, then how to go about appealing to those segments, and then ultimately how to effectively persuade, once we develop the targeted segments that we want, marketing persuasion that will meet the needs of those various segments that we have decided that we're going to target. So marketing research can help guide us through this marketing segmentation, targeting, and positioning. So marketing segmentation is the process of aggregating consumers into groups that have common needs and will respond similarly to marketing persuasion. Now, as I look out among you in this classroom today, there's a wide variety of sort of individuals in this class in terms of there's some age differences in this class. It used to be much greater, although you've become much more homogenized over the years. When I started teaching at UCO when I was 22 years old, the average age of our freshmen was 29 years old. That meant that they were non-traditional students. We have less and less of that in my classes today. It's become far more traditional, but we still have some people that are coming back to school to get a second degree or to work on a career change or something like that. And so there is some disparity between, some variance in the age of the student body population here at UCO compared to some other more traditional schools like OU and OSU, where they have a large campus population, a huge on-campus student body population. We don't have a tendency to do that. Does anybody live on campus here? 2 people out of the entire class. Most people, if you went to OU, live on or near campus. We are primarily a commuter school. And so there's a lot of difference. There's a lot of variance in the population of this room. But you have one thing in common that's going to lead you to respond to a marketing need similarly that makes you a segment. You all took marketing, principles of marketing at 9:30, and you have to have the required materials for this class, which you had to purchase either from the bookstore or from McGraw-Hill directly, right? So you all had that. So you are a segment in terms of your needs with regard to your class and principles of marketing, right? So a segment is common need. So you all have a common need, which is in order to pass the class, you have to be able to read the material and utilize or access the homework requirements and things like that. And so that makes you, for example, a segment. So segments are homogeneous groups of prospective buyers that result from the market segment process. So we can segment the market in various ways, and then that will lead to product differentiation using different marketing activities to help us better produce products that will compete in the marketplace. Almost every single thing is differentiated in the market today. When I was a kid growing up, we had far less differentiation than we do now. Differentiation may be the most important term in marketing. Everything is highly differentiated. When I was a kid, again, growing up, milk was a cow-based product. We now have things that we call milk that are in fact not milk. I think that they should be prohibited from calling it milk, but they do. Soy milk, not milk. Maybe soy juice, but that doesn't sound right, right? Like soy milk. Like soy plants don't lactate, right? But we call it milk. So again, when I was a kid growing up, milk was pretty much forever and ever and ever until I was about, I guess, in third grade, when they decided, well, maybe we need to cut out the fat in milk. So we'll start offering 2% or skim milk. Milk was whole, full-fledged, full-fat milk. Now you've got 2% milk, 1% milk, skim milk, chocolate milk, strawberry milk, soy milk, oat milk, things that are not milk. Highly differentiated, right? Maybe oat juice, but it's not really milk. So we differentiate all kinds of products. Eggs, again, when I was a kid growing up, you went to the grocery store and there's really just one, there was a little bit of differentiation in that they graded the eggs by size. So you could have medium, large, and extra large eggs. Most stores carried that. Some stores carried brown eggs. Most didn't. They were just eggs. We now have all different kinds of eggs, right? Omega enriched eggs. How do they get that? How do they differentiate that product? Well, they feed the chickens special diets that are thought to increase the omega acids, fatty acids in the egg itself. There's free range eggs. What does that mean? You think that these eggs are produced by chickens in a bucolic setting out on the plains where the chicken, no, free range can mean everything from they open the door and the eggs and the chickens are not in a cage to, yes, they are actually out and being moved around. Organic, certified organic eggs. You think that's a scam? Okay, right? You could have brown eggs. They now have heritage or heirloom eggs in a lot of the stores where you can get the blue and the green and the ones that have brown dots on them that are all different sizes. You can now buy quail eggs at the store. I saw those the other day. One of the stores in Dallas, it's a major store, carries goose eggs. So you can have all of these differentiations in terms of the eggs, whereas in the past, it was pretty much just people bought, you went to the store and you bought eggs, large eggs, white. So how do we segment markets? Well, we can have one product with multiple segments, for example, for different regions. So if you get online and you look at the news, based on where you are, oftentimes the websites that you use will offer different sorts of kinds of coverage. If you get on, for example, NBC, they're going to have like the national, the big national stories, but they'll also have maybe more local coverages. So what happened on Tuesday that was unique in Oklahoma City? Well, we reelected David Holt as mayor for a third term in Oklahoma City. And if you get on NBC News, I got on that and it popped up with, David Holt reelected to historic third term or something like that on my NBC news feed. I'm rather certain that if you were looking at the NBC news page in New York City, they weren't showing you that David Holt was reelected, right? So it's one product, but using really micro-targeting techniques based on where you are, we can get different kinds of coverage for that. You can have multiple products with multiple segments of things. So cars, again, when I was a kid growing up, there were vans and things like that. And by the time I got to junior high, minivans became a thing. But for the most part, if you lived in the country and were rural, you might drive a pickup truck. And if you lived in the city, you drove a car. There were trucks and cars, and most people drove one or the other. And more people drove cars than trucks. Now people drive trucks in greater numbers than they drive cars. And it's amazing to me how many of you drive trucks and have absolutely no reason to drive a truck other than, I don't know, we live in Oklahoma and we think it's cool. The number one selling vehicle in America is the Ford F-150. Does anybody need, if you live in an apartment, do you need a Ford F-150? No. What are you hauling around? What?
All your stuff when you're moving.
Yeah, you do that once. This is not like you're changing socks, you know. I mean, it's amazing to me how many of you like have these vehicles, these urban assault vehicles, right? So we now have SUVs, crossovers that are a combination of car, van, truck thing, right? We can also have mass customization. So Dell was one of the first to do these. They mass customized. When you bought a Dell, you ordered Dell and they put in the processor that you wanted, along with the suite of software that you wanted that was highly customizable. And now what we're seeing is people going back away from that because we don't really need that much customization. M&Ms, I think I've showed you the My M&Ms before. You can now customize the M&Ms with your picture, your event, the way you want it presented, all kinds of stuff. So we can segment markets in a lot of different ways. How do we go about doing that though? Well, we're going to group potential buyers into segments. We can do that by several criteria. We can do it by simplicity or cost effectiveness, just looking at certain things. If you are offering, for example, men's health products, you don't need to have a whole lot of maybe sophisticated market segmentation. There are lots of products that men need that women don't, right? So in men's health, for example, the drugs that they market are for prostate enlargement and things like that as you get older. Turns out one of these drugs that they market for that grew hair. And so they now market it for hair growth. And probably the bigger market for that product, it's called finasteride, and it was marketed under the brand name Propecia, is for actual hair growth, rather. But it started out as being a prostate health product that they then marketed. You can market or segment to increase your return on investment. You can look at similarity of needs of potential buyers, segmenting based on different needs among different segments, and then for the potential to actually reach a segment. You may decide that there are segments that you don't want in this process, that it's too costly to reach. So ways that we can segment. The simplest ways are things like geographic. When I was getting my PhD, I moved from Oklahoma to my home state, which is New Mexico. That's where I was born. but I got my PhD in southern New Mexico. I was born in Santa Fe. And if you were born in Santa Fe, people from Santa Fe have a tendency to think anything outside of Santa Fe is not New Mexico, because we have a tendency to have this view that like Santa Fe is all of New Mexico. Very sort of solipsistic view. But I got my PhD down at New Mexico State, which is on the border in Las Cruces, New Mexico. And they would tell me things like, oh, isn't it beautiful here? And I'm like, no, it looks like a moonscape. It looks like the face of the moon. It was desert and mountains and nothing. You couldn't raise a ruckus out there. And I had lived a considerable amount of time here in Oklahoma. And so culturally, I think I had become more of an Oklahoman than a New Mexican at that point. And I owned a boat and a personal watercraft called a Wave Runner. And I loved my boat and my Wave Runner. And if you went to the Yamaha dealer in Oklahoma City, they have lots of selections of boats and personal watercraft like Wave Runners for you to choose from. Why? We have a lot of lakes in Oklahoma. Now, turns out most of them weren't here to begin with. They're man-made, but we made a whole lot. All of them. Yeah, we have no natural lakes in Oklahoma. We have more shoreline than I believe Minnesota. And Minnesota is something like the land of 1,000 lakes. That's correct. Yeah, that is their slogan, is that they are a land of 1,000 lakes. We have more shoreline in Oklahoma because we've created all these lakes. So you can go to the lake and you can use your boat and your personal watercraft. Guess what they did not carry in the Yamaha dealer in Las Cruces, New Mexico? Boats or watercraft. They could order them for you, but they didn't have them there. They had quads, and they had side-by-sides, and they had dirt bikes, and they had street bikes. They had everything other than boats and personal watercraft. Why is that? No water. I think I told you all this. They asked fifth graders in Las Cruces this question: where are you most likely to see a boat? And the answer that students in the fifth grade gave in Las Cruces, New Mexico was on the highway. Because there's no lake in Las Cruces. And by the time the Rio Grande gets to Las Cruces, it's not so grand, because they dammed it up upstream. It's like you have these images as a child. You know, they showed these westerns, and they would show the Rio Grande, you know, going through South Texas and southern New Mexico, and it's this large. It was never ever the size of something like the Mississippi, but it was at one time a significant for that region water flow. It's not anymore, right? Because there's just not a lot of water in New Mexico, and they dam it up, and they, you know, have stopped it and used it for irrigation upstream so much that there's no place to put a boat in Las Cruces, New Mexico. How do they get water? There's no water reservoir. Most of our lakes in Oklahoma were built as water storage for local communities, right? We dammed up rivers in order to get these lakes, and that's the way we provide water. How do they get water in New Mexico? You have to go to the groundwater. You're looking for aquifers, deep drilling into aquifers. So you don't see a lot of boats in New Mexico. You see them, according to fifth graders in Las Cruces, on the highway. Yeah. Pipe it. Yep. They've actually started building communities outside of municipalities in Arizona that have no water. The way they get their water is they deliver it on truck, and you have basically a storage tank, and they're delivering it by truck to you. Yeah, absolutely insane. I don't know why anybody would buy in that area, because it seems like that would be, I don't know. We use a lot of water here. I mean, you're talking about if you're having to have water delivered on a truck, you're really having to think about when you do clothes, right? Like do laundry and things like that. And I'm thinking you probably want to do a lot of laundry in places like Arizona because it's hot and, and dusty and you sweat. So geographic, that's a fairly simple way to do it. Lots of products we're not going to be able to segregate by geographics. We can do demographics, ethnicity, age, gender, income. Those are also easy ways of doing it. The United States government, the Census Bureau, provides us with a lot of that information. Businesses have historically used it. So, for example, I live in Guthrie currently, and I serve on the city council there, and we don't have the restaurants that you have in Edmond. Why is that? It's basic demographic features. We don't have as large a population as Edmond. We don't have as wealthy a population as Edmond. Edmond is by and large the wealthiest community in the state of Oklahoma. It has the highest per capita income of any city in the state of Oklahoma over the whole. We can also use a more interesting way. So demographics, there are things again that you can segregate by male and female that are going to be necessary. Lots of, again, medications are segmented this way. Propecia is only for men. It's not marketed to women. Psychographics is more important, using things like the VALS system to determine what it is that people want based on their lifestyle. So it stands for values, attitudes, and lifestyles. And then we can also look at segmenting things by behavioral usage rates. So once we break the market up into segments, what can we do that? Well, we can group products into categories that we're going to use to make appeals to those segments. We can estimate the size of the markets that we're going to serve, in which case we can develop estimates of how many people we think are going to be attracted to a various product. And you may not want a lot of people. Rolex, for example, historically doesn't want to sell a watch to everybody. Rolex is very, very picky on their distribution network. And if you are an authorized Rolex dealer, you can lose it. So at one point in time, a lot of these jewelry stores that were mom and pop owned that had Rolex authorized dealerships were going out of business, and they were just selling off their inventory. And Walmart buyers were going in and buying that product, and they were putting Rolexes in Sam's Clubs. And Rolex had a cow over this because Rolex does not want to be sold in a Sam's Club, right? That is the antithesis of where Rolex wants to be sold. They don't want to sell a watch to everybody. Ferrari, yeah. So we can develop grids for, various features that we have in a product. So for example, the iPhone, at one point in time, and the reason I use this old example, the iPhone 7, is because they had a lot of different storage capacities. Now it's basically, they've figured out, as a result of looking at this overall, most people are either high storage users, and almost everybody has become a high storage user. So they've stopped really dividing it into small, medium, and large. Why is that? Because we're all taking massive amounts of storage intensive data, like videos for TikTok or whatever it is that you are posting on. So targeting, once we decide that we're going to select these segments, what do we do to target them? Well, we're going to look at things like the market size, whether or not we expect there to be growth, What is the competitive position of our product? How many of you in here have an iPhone? Raise your hands. Anybody have something other than an iPhone? No one. Why is it that you all have an iPhone? You think they're superior. All my friends who have like any kind of knowledge of technology say that iPhones are not superior. But what's that? Okay, better picture quality. One of the things that they've done a study on is kids, and kids don't want anything other than an iPhone historically until very recently, because they didn't want to be the green color in a text messaging group. They did not want, we are as a species very group centric, and we respond to peer pressure, and particularly young people are very peer conscious, aren't they? Because kids are cruel. And so literally they did the study of asking parents, why is it that you, and they're like, our kids absolutely, like many children, not just some, many children were like, if I don't get an iPhone, just don't bother to get me a phone. Because they did not want to be the green text in a text message. So, in fact, they've come up with a color for the messaging. It's called iMessage Blue. That's specific to iPhones. So we're going to select based on, the expected growth, our competitive position, what makes iPhone so competitive. Well, iMessaging is one of the things that made, particularly among young people, that made iPhones highly competitive, as people wanted the ability to have those features that were associated with iMessaging. Now, it has gotten to the point where it's harder to differentiate between an iPhone and something else, because one of the things that absolutely was blocked for a long time, if you didn't have the iPhone and you had a group text message and you used emoticons or emojis, I don't know what emoticon is probably an old-fashioned term for emojis, it didn't come across to non-iPhone users the way it does now. They've fixed that, right? They've now made it so that those are compatible across texting platforms, but there was still a huge disparity between, in the eyes of the consumer. Was there a real disparity? I don't know. But among the impression in the consumer mind, there was a difference, so that we can take marketing action. Once we define the segments, once we choose the segments that we're going to want to take, we then have to position our product in the market. That is the position that the product is going to occupy in the mind of the consumer. Where is it that you want the consumer to think about your product? And there are things that we can say. I can give you name brands of things, and we all probably have a similar image in the mind of the consumer. If I say McDonald's versus Vast, how many of you know what Vast is? Okay, almost everybody knows. If I say McDonald's versus Vast, what are some of the things you're probably going to say? Cheaper, right? Not exclusive. Faster. More locations. You can get McDonald's right down on 2nd Street. Vast, you're going to have to go to the top of the Devon Tower, right? So it's not convenient. So what is the position that McDonald's has occupied in the mind of the consumer for a long period of time? The position that McDonald's occupied was basically that it was fast, cheap, and consistent. Now, whether or not it's cheap anymore is kind of debatable. Fast food has become pretty expensive, in my opinion, for the quality of the food that you are getting. But it's still cheaper than Vast. Vastly cheaper than Vast. It's still faster than Vast. And it's still probably going to be more consistent. Like, Yes, right? They're going to focus on quality control in nice restaurants, but when you're dealing with products that are not highly processed, you are going to have more variability in that process. McDonald's tightly controls their supply chain for things like beef patties. And by the way, they're probably not as good as they used to be because they don't put the pink goo in them anymore, right? And we're not frying them in beef tallow. Well, that's the French fries. They're not frying the French fries. At one point in time, McDonald's fries were better than they are. They're still pretty good, but they were even better because they were fried in beef tallow. Why did they stop frying them in beef tallow? Well, because there's all of these, consumers, these commies that have popped up that are vegetarian, right? And I'm convinced that vegetarian and vegan is definitely like that is nothing but code for I'm going to be very problematic. Yeah, I mean, I'm going to be highly problematic. All of my friends who are vegans, no point in going out to eat, But McDonald's decided that they wanted to have vegetarian options. And if you're frying stuff in beef tallow, it's not vegetarian. So once you've established your position in the mind of the consumer, it can be really difficult to change it. McDonald's is a prime example of something that has attempted to change their position in the mind of the consumer. When I was a kid, again, growing up, McDonald's were these large kind of buildings. Most of them had a playground that had the whole cast of characters from McDonald's, like the Hamburglar and Ronald McDonald and all of these other things, and they had these playgrounds. The tool of the devil, known as Starbucks, started to cut into McDonald's share of one of their most profitable market segments, which is the breakfast segment. And so what did McDonald's do? They tried to reposition themselves to be more like Starbucks. Modern McDonald's and they have repositioned their menu. I'm not sure how successful this has been with things like the McCafe, so that you can get the more expensive and customized coffee drink. Forever and ever and ever, McDonald's just sold coffee. But now they've got the McCafe, which will give you a vanilla iced coffee, which again is a tool of the devil. Right? Coffee should be drunk black, right? Nothing in it. If you put stuff in it you don't like coffee, you like other stuff, right? That's one of the reasons Starbucks is a tool of the devil, because Starbucks figured out that if we serve really bad coffee, people will order a latte. Because if you put hot milky cream in it, it doesn't matter how bad the coffee is, right? You're not drinking the coffee, you're drinking the sugar and the heavy whipping cream that they've frothed up into, 1,000-calorie product. Yeah. There is nothing good about Starbucks. Really? You think it's got more than a Monster Energy drink? Okay. I'm still like, drink more coffee. Drink more McDonald's coffee. I'm a big fan of McDonald's coffee, by the way. Like, see, big fan of McDonald's coffee. So it can be very difficult to change products in the mind of consumer. I have a friend who insists, he's like, let's go to Starbucks. Their food is, now this is what he likes at Starbucks. He likes an English muffin with cheese and sausage. That's called a sausage McMuffin, by the way. And he's like, it's just cleaner at Starbucks. And I'm like, I want to shoot you in the head because it is exactly the same product. It's the same rubbery cheese, as they have at McDonald's. It's just you're paying $1.50 more for it at Starbucks. And this is like a made up, as a marketer, I should appreciate this, but this like clean food, that's a made up bullshit word. Right? Term. It means nothing. What does that mean? What does it mean? I ask people and they're like, well, it's less processed. Really? Really? Starbucks sausage is less processed than McDonald's? No. It's right. Yeah. It's exactly the same stuff. So, there are these distinctions in the mind of consumers. Whether or not they exist is something else. Reality is, or perception is reality in the mind of the consumer. And consumers view Starbucks as being a superior product, even though in many instances, by objective standards, if you like black coffee, McDonald's always beats Starbucks in blind taste tests, right? Any questions about that? All right, so next week you will be working on the second exam, right? So if you have questions before, you need to text or email me. And if you got ducks today,